Dr. Joseph Dorsey says, research is a systematic search for information and truth. It's a process of inquiry. We've already discussed how science is a way of thinking, so scientific research is the integration of empirical thought and rational processes. This section introduces concepts to which science is built, assumptions of science, and research is a powerful tool for science. Systematic, a process. This formalized approach to acquiring knowledge is what sets scientific research apart from other ways of knowing, from other ways of hunting and gathering information, from other search protocols. It's certainly true that the scientific method is natural. It evolved, like all of our other traits, in nature, as the human animal, blessed with an abnormally large neocortex, went about adapting to its environment, forming mental models of the world around it. All children come into the world with curiosity and the impetus toward trial and error. Just watch babies try to put everything in their mouth to see. All of us mix inductive and deductive reasoning patterns as we navigate our days and nights, forming often half-baked hypotheses from our observations and our guesses and our successes, and very often our mistakes and failures. We judge outcomes and we form prejudices. We look for confirmations of our typologies, of our ability to group things into perceived patterns, and we often end up with stereotypes. When we go wrong, as history has so unforgivingly shown us, it's usually because we fell into the naive assumption trap, which Samuel Jackson famously cautioned us against in the movie Pulp Fiction.
So you're assuming I won't shoot your sorry ass, and everyone knows when you make an assumption, you make an ass out of you and umption.
The assumptions of science, as we pointed out in our lecture on Science as a Way of Thinking, are different from prejudices because as scientists, we act not just as pre-judges, but as post-judges, continually reserving judgment until yet another experiment is performed. And this is because we follow research methods. As Dr. Dorsey pointed out in the introductory paragraph, research is a powerful tool for science. Now think about that. A tool. When you do science, you use a tool. And tools, we all know, were created for specific tasks. When you use a tool for the right task and you use it correctly, you make progress. If you use the wrong tool or use it in the wrong way, you can end up stuck or with a disaster on your hands. Like think of trying to use a hammer to open a can of peaches. The results usually aren't pretty. It's said that to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we have to admit the limitations of all tools, including those we use in scientific research. But the tool metaphor is important because actually research methods are tools, plural, a whole collection or suite of tools, like a surgeon's tray, which when properly employed can perform fine and delicate brain surgeries or can butcher a victim like you see in those late-night horror movies. Healthy skepticism, which is part and parcel of the scientific way of thinking, is a tool that can help us ensure we don't blunder into dogma. At the same time, though, too much skepticism can lead otherwise rational people to continuously miss the trends in the data and blind them to the big picture, such as we see in climate change deniers. Acquiring knowledge through research is a subtle art. There isn't really a formula, and yet it is formal. It is systematic. It's a process, and one that you can learn to get good at. Graziano and Raulin, in our Reading Research Methods, A Process of Inquiry, corroborate this, saying that scientific research is similar to everyday thought, but it is more formalized, more deliberate, and therefore more accurate and reliable. It's the reliability that really sets it apart. Remember from our first lecture that there can be no right or wrong in science, just stronger or weaker hypotheses. Hypotheses that always need to be revised and retested as new observations are made and new data comes in, because our framing of reality may change once we undergo another paradigm shift. And we must recognize the game-changing differences between getting precision from our research and getting accuracy. Precision is getting finer and finer levels of granularity or detail. Accuracy is about closer and closer approximations to the truth or whatever the target is. You can, for example, measure the temperature of your apartment in the city very, very precisely, down to 1/100th or 1/1000th of a degree. But it may tell you nothing about the urban heat island effect or global warming, particularly if the measuring device is not calibrated, or if you're standing next to the kitchen stove. People make the mistake of equating precision with accuracy when they're weighing themselves on the bathroom scale all the time. Sometimes a gross estimate is more accurate in terms of its utility or usefulness than a very precise measurement. The question is, what question are you trying to answer? Graziano and Raulin remind us that even the basic assumptions of science are, quote, ideas that are tentatively accepted as being true without further examination, and that, quote, science makes few assumptions, preferring to subject most ideas to rational and empirical challenges, end quote. The faith that we run on in science echoes Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and thus that a physical universe exists that can be known by beings who exist in it and think, particularly if they use the tentative but strong idea that despite the randomness and unpredictability of things, the universe is primarily an orderly system, and hence can be systematically studied, and the orderliness of it is indeed discoverable. Otherwise, there would be no point. Even though, as they point out, quote, all knowledge and even theories are tentative. But please do not fall into the trap set by the anti-scientific crowd. A theory is actually nothing like a hypothesis. A theory is not a guess. A theory is the strongest available and prevailing idea or model of a given reality or truth that we have. Say the authors, quote, only concepts that have survived scientists' repeated empirical challenges reach the level of generally accepted scientific theory, awaiting scientists' further challenges to expose its flaws. But these challenges are not the political grandstanding of profiteers and sloppy thinkers. To expose the flaws in the prevailing theory, one must do proper, formal, rational, empirical research, and then, quote, propose better theories that can explain current research findings and predict new phenomena, end quote. The flying spaghetti monster explanation of human affairs and environmental woes just won't cut it, nor will blaming things on sunspots or space aliens. To revise a theory, one needs to pose the best questions and then develop procedures for answering them. And one has to plan and make appropriate empirical observations and rationally interpret those empirical observations interwoven with rational abstractions so the interpretations can be coherently used to successfully predict other events. There's a lot more that goes into this process than just naysaying and making up alternative facts and explanations. So we have to get clear on what is empirical and what are facts, and how do we derive them. Wikipedia's definition of empirical knowledge is important. They say, quote, empirical evidence, also known as sensory experience, is the information received by means of the senses, particularly by observation and documentation of patterns of behavior through experimentation. The term comes from the Greek word for experience, empeiria. Then they say, after Immanuel Kant in philosophy, it is common to call the knowledge gained empirically a posteriori knowledge, in contrast to a priori knowledge. Now please note two things. One, empirical has nothing to do with imperialism. When scientists use empirical evidence to defeat a new hypothesis that rebels and heretics insist signals a new paradigm shift, like the idea that homeopathy actually works, just because the famous AIDS researcher Luc Montagnier recently observed an effect in one test tube that seemed to be caused by the presence of another test tube filled with a radically diluted sample. This is not a case of the Empire Strikes Back. Empirical testing doesn't have anything to do with defending the empire or the old guard. Empirical testing means, quote, we are gaining more experience before jumping to conclusions, end quote. Just because the word empire came to refer to political entities with the longest experience ruling has nothing to do with empirical science. They have nothing to do with one another. Science is not dogma, and scientists are the biggest rebels against the empire we have. But we don't use violence or threats to revise our models of reality. We simply gain more experience, and we try to gain it directly through our senses and through environmental sensors, usually technologies like microscopes that extend our senses enable us to record their observations, and through documentation processes that don't allow us to play the he said he saw, but she said she saw games. And that good old German philosopher, Kant, why, he was just using Latin to tell us not to be prejudiced. That is, not to prejudge, which would be a priori, or prior knowledge, and instead to do most things a posteriori, which doesn't mean by the seat of your pants, but means after the facts have been gathered. So let's talk about facts. Contrary to the political opinions of the ridiculously irresponsible and scientifically illiterate Kellyanne Conway, counselor to the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, there's no such thing as alternative facts. To a scientist, facts are not truths, which there can't be alternatives to either. Facts are, as Graziano and Raulin stress, merely, quote, those events that we can observe directly and repeatedly, end quote. Often they're behaviors. And if it can't be observed directly, if it must be inferred, then it isn't a fact. An inference, they tell us, is an intellectual process in which we derive conclusions from observed facts or from other ideas. Internal states, like how a creature is feeling or what people are thinking, must be inferred, but any conclusions we draw can be reassessed as new facts come to light and inform a more solid observational base to support inferences that we cannot directly observe. Crowd size can be observed. What it means for the popularity of a president or for the feelings of the people in the base, in the crowd, is an inference. And yes, there can be alternative conclusions, but no alternative facts, Kelly, FYI. The authors of our reading point out that we can draw inferences from inferences, but that isn't the best science. Quote, the better the observational base and the more ways scientists can tie inferences to that base, the more confidence they will have in those inferences. Just give us the facts, says Joe Friday in the Dragnet television series. We'll draw our own inferences. Look on page 29 for that. Statistical methods are the research tools we use to get the confidence intervals that give us confidence in our inferences, that plus or minus thing, those cat whiskers diagrams, aka the box and whiskers plot, and the idea of standard deviations and p-values, where p stands for probability of significance. Without the application of these mathematical tools, your confidence, or lack thereof, means little. You can't do as George W. Bush did and go with your gut, especially when it comes to matters of life and death, like the suspected presence of weapons of mass destruction. The problem, of course, is that we're dealing with what education reformer John Taylor Gatto famously called weapons of mass instruction, bad science education that enables people to, as our reading tells us, quote, use a construct, an explanatory idea constructed by research to explain some observed behaviors and thus generate a course of action that proved effective in one narrow area, and then use it so frequently, and out of context, I might add, that they, quote, lose sight of its analogical nature and begin to think it is a fact, end quote. The authors use the example of people who take psychology classes and, quote, actually believe there really is an id, an ego, or a superego inside each of us, or who watch the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out and come away thinking we have little homunculus creatures living in our heads pulling levers. Quote, these constructs take on a reality that they were never meant to have, they say. Confusing a construct for a fact is a logical error known as reification of a construct. Now, the authors actually list a table of the common logical errors that the scientific method, used properly, is supposed to help us avoid, like the nominal fallacy, where you mistake the naming of a phenomenon for the actual phenomenon, such as thinking that people who behave aggressively are aggressive, or that wasted materials are waste. The all or none bias is another one, where you tend to see statements as true or false instead of probabilistic. We heard this in George W.'s famous politicizing statement, you're either with us or against us. And it plays out in almost all prejudices. Now, I don't want to be prejudiced against all prejudgments, of course, so I don't say all, I say almost all, or I would suffer from the same fallacy. Then there's the similarity-uniqueness paradox, where you fail to see that most things have both similarities and differences at the same time, and which stands out for you depends on what you are looking for. Try thinking through that the next time you go on a date. But there's the Barnum effect, where you appear oh so clever and insightful because you say obvious things with an air of authority. The error in logic is named after the circus showman P.T. Barnum, who told us there's a sucker born every minute, and profited off of that belief. Quote, Barnum's statements appear to be insightful comments about an issue, when in fact they're nothing more than statements that are true for almost all issues, situations, or people, end quote. And hence they say almost nothing of substance about specific instances. Then there's evaluation biases of language, where you insert subtle judgments in the descriptions of otherwise objective behaviors, biasing the interpretation of those behaviors and hence the inferences. Like calling a person under observation by the police a suspect. That's one of those biases that often gets innocent people killed. Perhaps in police legal parlance, instead of the suspect, we should just say the subject, as we do in science, or the person being observed, especially in a society that's supposed to presume people innocent until proven otherwise. Anyway, in science, if not law, we're supposed to be non-judgmental, so watch your language. Awareness of these biases is part of the toolkit that we use to acquire knowledge through research. And then, of course, as we continue our summary of the reading, the authors present the fine points about when and how to use inductive and deductive thinking, which we covered a bit in the first lecture, remembering that, quote, people have been thinking inductively and deductively all their lives, although not with scientific precision. This last point, say the authors, quote, is important because although scientists use the same kind of reasoning, they must do so with a precision rarely seen in everyday life, end quote. Indeed, we can view the entire scientific research enterprise as a framework within which scientists carry out inductive and deductive reasoning under the most precise conditions, that's their quote, using a process that entails systematic inductive deductive logic. On page 34, the authors distinguish between theories that emphasize induction, which start with and stay close to the empirical data and build up from there, and theories that emphasize deduction, which start with hypothetical constructs and then test these empirically and go down from there. Then the authors talk about functional theories that place approximately equal emphasis on induction and deduction. All are actually functionally similar, however, because they insist on the discipline of, quote, organizing knowledge, predicting new observations, and explaining relationships among events, end quote. The authors point out that models are a type of theory, but that they are less formal and can be thought of actually as mini-theories, things that, quote, represent reality but do not duplicate it. Their chief use is to generate new ideas and offer new perspectives, and their strength comes from the number of independent observations they are based on and their ability to correctly predict new observations. The authors stress that a model, quote, does not have to be real or even true to be useful. It need only make accurate predictions about relationships between observable events. Models are, quote, simplified representations with point-to-point correspondence with some characteristics of the phenomenon being studied, end quote. They provide convenient, manageable, and compact representations of the larger complex and, they say, mostly unknown reality. They are incomplete, tentative, and analogical, and their manipulations, quote, help scientists organize information and illustrate relationships among parts and create new ideas and predict new observations. Models aren't right or wrong, just more or less useful. Page 35. But the last things from the paper that I want to summarize this week are the phases of a research study shown in Table 2.2. There's the idea-generating phase. Identify your topic, the topic that you find interesting enough to study. In the problem definition phase, refine our vague ideas into a precise question. Then the procedures design phase, decide on the specific procedures to be used in the gathering and statistical analysis of the data. And then the observation phase, use the procedures devised in the previous step to collect your observations. Then you go on to the data analysis phase where you analyze the data collected using appropriate statistical procedures. And then the interpretation phase. You compare your results with the results predicted based on your theory. Do your results support the theory? Then comes the communication phase. Prepare a written or oral report of your study for the publication or presentation to colleagues. The report should include a description of all the preceding steps so others can follow in your footsteps and replicate your work. Only in this way can enough empirical data be generated to show the true strengths and weaknesses of your hypothesis. Replication. Science is a collective effort. Figure 2.1 represents the formal flow of this process. And just before the end of the paper, the authors tackle the constraints that scientific discipline imposes on us, talking about our responsibilities as scientists and the trade-offs between precision and flexibility, and the nuances necessary to decide when the trade-off between precision and control against flexibility might be too great a price to pay. Sorry, science is not cookbook. It involves ethical choices, and at the end of the chapter, they show us that it involves these levels of constraint, the dimension of precision, structure, and control. In Table 2.4, the authors list some of these levels of constraint from least constraining to most. The first level of constraint listed is naturalistic observation, where the researcher does nothing to limit or change the environment or behavior of participants. That's like natural science, natural history. And then there are case study methods in which the participant is moved into a moderately limiting environment, intervening to a degree and observing the participants' responses. Then comes correlational research, where we quantify the strength of the relationship between two variables, carefully defining and precisely following measurement procedures. After that, differential research, where we compare two or more pre-existing groups of participants in a setting that is usually constrained and where measurement procedures must be carefully defined and precisely followed. And lastly, there's experimental research, where we assign participants randomly to groups and then test each group under a different condition that we set up. That's the most interventionist. The authors talk about how we then move from one constraint level to another as we refine our models and understandings, and how conclusions drawn from low constraint research can be the starting points for high constraint questions and procedures. And that's one of the major functions of low constraint research, to start by observing things and then move toward more constrained research. And that helps us in this precision versus relevance problem. They also note that while we try to refine our questions so we can answer them, quote, using the highest constraint level possible, we must also work within the current knowledge and the practical and ethical constraints on the researcher. That from page 44. The last point is critical in this age of Anthropocene blunders, when so much good science has been used so badly. Quote, every student entering the field of research needs to know that the researcher bears personal responsibility to conduct research in an ethical manner. Only when your research plan can stand up to ethical challenges should you as an investigator proceed with the next phase, making observations. End quote. After all, if your discovery decreased our prospects for sustainability, like the unfortunate invention of nuclear weapons and reactors, or organophosphate pesticides, or the use of fossil fuels in internal combustion engines that work perfectly well with alcohol, would you really want to be the person doing that kind of science? Acquiring knowledge through research, it turns out, requires not just a good sense of what methodologies and tools to use, but a sense of morality. Luckily, there are scientific methods for figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of our moral philosophies too. So you can't really go wrong with science, because after all, science is merely
Latin for
to know.